Yesterday, he drove tanks for the Duce. Today, he tightened bolts for the Republic. In 1948, in a roaring factory hall on the outskirts of Turin, Giovanni Rinaldi stood at a Fiat assembly line, hands black with grease, and thought about the uniforms he had worn. He bent over a chassis suspended from the overhead conveyor and whispered words that, if spoken aloud during the war, would have earned him imprisonment for defeatism. "I fought for a world that no longer exists. I work now for a country that pretends the old one was never real." The wrench in his hand clicked with monotonous precision. One bolt, then another, then another. Cars moved past like an endless column. 8 years earlier, his hands had tightened tracks on tanks headed for the Libyan desert and the Russian steppe. The mathematics of his life had been recalculated in a single decade, from fascist empire to defeated kingdom, from civil war to fragile republic, from slogans about Mare Nostrum to posters urging citizens to vote for Democrazia e Libertà. The collapse of Italian confidence had begun long before the armistice of 1943. June 1940. Rome. Giovanni had been a conscript in the Royal Italian Army, standing in a crowded barracks as Mussolini announced Italy's entry into the war from a balcony at Palazzo Venezia. "We shall break the back of British power in the Mediterranean," the Duce thundered. In the courtyard, young men in grey-green uniforms cheered, some from conviction, others because not cheering under fascism was dangerous. Giovanni, son of a railway worker from Emilia, felt a hot mixture of pride and unease. Italy, they had been taught, had been cheated at Versailles, humiliated as a proletarian nation. Now, fascism would restore Roman greatness. Posters on the barracks' walls showed heroic soldiers marching under fasces and eagles, farmers bringing in impossible harvests, workers at modern forges building the steel of empire. The black shirts paraded in black tunics. Italian military intelligence promised easy victories. The British were decadent imperialists clinging to a dying empire. The Greeks were disorganized peasants. The Yugoslavs divided. The Russians, if it came to that, were subhuman Bolsheviks. Within 2 years, those assumptions collapsed. In Greece, Italian offensives bogged down in mountain snow and mud. Greek soldiers, supposedly inferior, held ground stubbornly and counterattacked. In North Africa, British forces mauled poorly supplied Italian divisions, capturing tens of thousands. Giovanni saw the gap between propaganda and reality for the first time in Libya in 1941. "We were told the Arabs welcomed us as liberators," he wrote in a letter never sent. "They sell us water at twice the price and tell both us and the British that they hope we leave soon." Then the Germans arrived. Afrika Korps units under Rommel appeared with better tanks, better logistics, better discipline. Italian officers praised them publicly and whispered resentfully in private. The mathematics of the Axis partnership were clear. Germany, industrial giant, senior partner. Italy, junior ally, resource poor, expected to contribute men and territory, but not strategy. Giovanni watched German officers treat Italian units as auxiliaries. He watched German supply trucks rumble past while his own unit lacked fuel. He watched desert graves multiply. Later, transferred to the Eastern Front as part of the Italian Eighth Army on the Don, he saw what crusade against Bolshevism meant in practice. Endless steppe, underdressed Italian soldiers in thin overcoats facing Soviet troops and weather they were never prepared for. In January 1943, when the Soviet offensive smashed through Axis lines, the Italian army on the Don dissolved in snow and blood. Giovanni survived by walking west. For days, weeks, he saw dead men frozen where they fell, arms outstretched as if pleading. He saw German field police shoot stragglers, He saw discipline evaporate and something more primitive emerge, a will simply to live long enough to see trees again instead of snow. By summer, he was back in Italy, on leave, when the news hit, July 25, 1943. Mussolini arrested. The Grand Council of Fascism turned on its creator. The king dismissed the Duce. Marshal Badoglio announced a new government. In the bars of Turin, men spoke in half-whispers. Fascism is over. On the walls, someone had scribbled overnight, Abbasso il Duce. Down with the Duce. Giovanni walked past his old party headquarters. The bronze fascist plaque had been removed hastily, leaving pale rectangles on the stone. Men who had once worn black shirts now emerged in grey suits, claiming they had always had reservations. But the war was not over. Not yet. September 8, 1943. The armistice. Radio announcements declared that Italy had signed an armistice with the Allies. The fascist empire was finished. For a brief, intoxicating moment, soldiers in barracks across the peninsula cheered. "We are finally out," Giovanni thought. Then the Germans moved. Within hours, Wehrmacht and SS units executed plans they had prepared for months. They disarmed Italian units across occupied territory. Those who resisted were shot. Those who surrendered were herded into trains. No longer Allies, now Italian military internees, and shipped to camps in Germany and Poland. In Rome, German forces took control. In the north, they freed Mussolini from his mountain prison and installed him as the head of the puppet. Italian Social Republic, RSI, at Salo. Italy fractured. The king and Badoglio fled south under Allied protection, establishing a co-belligerent government. The south became Allied-occupied, liberated. Italy. The center and north became Republican fascist. Italy under German occupation. The front line ran roughly across the spine of the peninsula. Giovanni, caught in the north, faced a choice that did not feel like a choice at all. Join the RSI army and continue fighting alongside Germans under a regime that was fascism, stripped of illusions. Or disappear into the mountains with the partisans, into the factories as an anonymous worker, into a German camp as a prisoner. He joined, briefly, an RSI unit out of fear and inertia. He still wore a uniform, but now the eagles on shoulders were German, the authority foreign. He saw how thin the new fascist veneer was. Grand speeches from Salo promised revenge and renewal. Reality was German officers giving orders while Italian fascist militiamen tried to reimpose fear in towns where their power had evaporated overnight. By 1944, the resistance in northern Italy was no longer scattered bands, but organized formations, communist Garibaldi brigades, action party units, Catholic and monarchist groups. From factories in Milan and Turin to valleys in Piedmont and Emilia, partisans ambushed convoys, cut telephone lines, sabotaged trains shipping goods to Germany. Reprisals followed. In small towns, German and RSI troops posted proclamations. For every German or Republican soldier killed by bandits, 10 Italians will be shot. Names appeared on lists. Sometimes no names at all, just groups taken as hostages. Giovanni witnessed one such reprisal in a village near Modena, where his unit was stationed briefly. A German officer, tired and irritated, read from a list in bad Italian. "These 10 will pay for the attack yesterday." The 10 lined up in front of a ditch. A priest tried to speak. He was shoved aside, shots cracked. The war had turned in on itself. Italians killing Italians under German supervision. Giovanni's disillusionment, already deep from Russia, became complete. At night, he listened to Radio London on a smuggled set. He heard the voice of Colonel Buonasera urging Italians to resist. He heard names of partisan units fighting in regions he knew. In late 1944, After a particularly brutal roundup of suspected partisans, he deserted. Desertion was punishable by death. He knew that. He walked away from his unit under cover of fog, wearing civilian clothes under his uniform. He dumped the uniform in a ditch, as he had once dumped fascist illusions. For a while, he hid in barns, fed by families who had lost sons to both German camps and partisan units. Eventually, he found his way to a partisan formation in the Apennines. They asked him many questions. Which unit? Where stationed? How many Germans? Then the more dangerous one, why now? He did not speak of ideology, he spoke of Russia, of reprisal ditches, of friends who had disappeared into German camps. It was enough. The partisans were pragmatic. They needed men, especially men who knew German routines. For months he fought in a dirty, improvisational war. Ambushes, quick withdrawals, endless mud. He saw communist commissars argue with Catholic fighters about the future of Italy. Land reform, workers' councils, monarchy, republic. He saw British special operations officers land at night, distributing weapons and orders. He saw Germans grow more brutal as their situation worsened. April 1945. The final insurrections in the north. Partisans rose in city after city, Genoa, Turin, Milan. Factory sirens doubled as signals. Italians who had pretended to accept fascism for 20 years tore down plaques, hunted down known torturers, ambushed retreating German columns. Mussolini tried to flee to Switzerland in a German convoy. He was captured by partisans, executed, his body hung in Milan. The fascist dream of empire ended not with triumphant marches, but with a corpse dangling in a gas station square. When the war ended, Italy did not find unity. It found a new arena for its divisions, politics, a referendum on the monarchy. We have fought for 20 years under a king who signed fascist decrees, Republicans argued. He must go. Conservatives and monarchists, many in the South, insisted the monarchy had held Italy together, that the king had saved the country by dismissing Mussolini in 1943. The vote was close. The Republic won, a narrow but decisive majority, with the North largely Republican, the South more monarchist. For Giovanni, who had seen orders signed by both king and Duce, the result felt less like revolution than adjustment. The Savoy dynasty left. A provisional constitution took shape. Parties formed and reformed, Christian Democrats, socialists, communists, liberals. The Italian Communist Party, PCI, strong from its role in the resistance, believed it might legitimately claim a leading role in the new order. The Christian Democrats, backed materially and morally by the United States and the Church, saw communist power as an existential threat. The Cold War turned Italy into a front line without tanks, money, propaganda, secret operations. These became the weapons. In 1948, the first national elections of the Republic approached. Posters covered walls. On one side, Vota Democrazia Cristiana, with family imagery, priests' endorsements, warnings of atheist communism. On the other, the Popular Democratic Front of communists and socialists, red flags, photos of fallen partisans, promises of land, work, equality. In Fiat's assembly hall, the election felt like another mobilization. Union organizers passed leaflets at the factory gates in the early dawn. Priests preached politics from pulpits on Sunday, hinting that voting wrong would endanger souls. American influence arrived in strange forms. Grain shipments, labeled "Gift of the People of the United States," fed hungry Italians. Voice of America broadcasts warned of Soviet tyranny. The CIA funneled money to anti-communist forces in secret operations that would only be revealed decades later. For Giovanni, tightening bolts on the 1100 and 1400 models, the high politics translated into more immediate questions. Would he keep his job if the left lost? Would his past as a fascist conscript, RSI deserter, and partisan fighter matter? Would his children grow up under a red flag or one with the tricolour and a new emblem? He did not trust any slogan entirely. He had seen too many. Credere, obdidere, combattere painted on barracks walls, W. Stalin scrawled on village barns, Dio Patria Familia plastered on city posters. In the end, he voted for the Christian Democrats, almost reluctantly. Not because he felt deep devotion to the church's political arm, but because he feared Italy becoming another pawn, this time of Moscow, having just escaped being a pawn of Berlin. The Christian Democrats won decisively, boosted by American support and church pressure. The PCI retreated to opposition, powerful but blocked from government. Italy's path solidified, a Western capitalist democracy, fragile, corrupt, but functional. On the shop floor, that meant something concrete. Fiat expanded. Contracts flowed. The economic miracle that would define the 1950s and 1960s in Western Europe began to stir. Where once Giovanni had marched under fascist banners for an empire that devoured its own soldiers with incompetence, he now stood under fluorescent lights, producing cars that would soon fill the streets of a consumer society. The mathematics of this new order were different from those of fascist dreams. Under Mussolini, glory promised. Defeat delivered. Empire imagined. Graves dug. Under the Republic, no glory promised. Stability delivered imperfectly. Empire renounced. Products shipped. Italy renounced its ambitions in Africa, its dreams of a Mare Nostrum, its fantasy of being a great power on par with Britain and France. In exchange, it gained Marshall Plan funds, NATO protection, and access to markets. But this new order carried its own silences. War crimes committed by Italian forces in Ethiopia, in Yugoslavia, in Greece, villages burned, hostages shot, were rarely discussed. Trials were few. Many documents were filed away, some in what would later be called the Armadio della Vergogna, the cupboard of shame. Former fascist officials reappeared in administration and business, not always at the top, but at crucial nodes. Their expertise and connections made them useful. Their pasts, when inconvenient, were blurred by phrases like, "He was only following orders," or "We were all fascists then." The partisan movement, once praised, fragmented in memory. Communists framed it as a revolutionary beginning cut short. Conservatives tried to cut its communist component out of the national story, praising only patriotic elements. In state ceremonies, crowns were laid at tombs of the unknown soldier. Speeches spoke of unity, sacrifice, all Italians. They rarely mentioned that some Italians had lined others up by ditches under German oversight, that some had fought for Salo until 1945 with as much conviction as others had fought in the mountains, that the Royal Army had served both the Duce and his jailers. In Fiat's break rooms, veterans sat at tables with enamel mugs of coffee, not arranged by which side they had been on, but by which shift and which department. Next to Giovanni, tightening bolts on the line, might stand a man who had guarded Jews in a transit camp, another who had spent 2 years in a German labor camp after refusing to fight for the RSI, another who had quietly signed up for the king's co-belligerent army in the south. They rarely discussed it. Work provided a neutral language, production quotas, wages, safety hazards, rumors of layoffs. In 1949, when NATO was formed and Italy signed on, some workers muttered that Italy had simply exchanged one master Berlin for another, Washington. Giovanni shrugged. At least, he told a younger colleague, The Americans send Wheaton machines, not orders, to shoot our neighbors. His cynicism was not ideological. It was the weariness of a man who had marched under 3 flags in less than 10 years. The Savoy flag under a fascist regime, the RSI banner under German command, the tricolor of a fragile republic. He had worn a fascist star, a partisan band, and, briefly, the badge of the new Italian army when called up for reserve training. Institutions changed, emblems changed. The line at Fiat did not. The bolts needed tightening just the same. At home, his children brought school books that skated lightly over the fascist period. Mussolini appeared in a few paragraphs. Rise, dictatorship, alliance with Hitler, disaster, execution. The partisans got some pages. The civil war within Italy was compressed into a phrase, a period of internal conflict. His son once asked, over a plate of pasta, "Papa, in the war, were you a fascist or a partisan?" Giovanni paused. "I was a soldier," he said carefully. "First for the king and the Duce. Later, when I understood what that meant, for the partisans. Mostly, I was someone who didn't want to die in someone else's dreams." The boy frowned, dissatisfied with the non-answer. At church, the priest preached reconciliation. Confession, forgiveness, moving forward. The church had its own past to navigate. Many clerics had blessed fascist banners in the 1920s and 1930s. Now the Vatican presented itself as the guardian of democracy against godless communism. In union meetings, communist organizers painted a different picture, a working class betrayed by fascism, by monarchy, by American meddling, still waiting for its true liberation. Giovanni attended both spaces. Church on Sunday, union meetings when ordered by shop stewards. He listened, nodded sometimes, kept his own counsel. He knew that liberation was not a single event in 1945. It was a process measured in rents paid on time, in children who did not have to go to war at 20, in wives who did not have to queue for hours for chestnuts as they had in the winter of 1944. He also knew that Italy's new democracy stood on foundations that included men like him, with mixed pasts and unresolved guilt. In the late 1940s, observers abroad praised Italy as a success story, a former fascist state turned democratic, holding the line against communism in Western Europe. They did not see the quiet compromises that sustained that success. Former fascists unpunished because prosecuting them would have required admitting how many there had been. Partisan memories honored selectively to keep the communists loyal to the parliamentary system. War crimes left unexplored to avoid diplomatic fights with new allies like West Germany. For Giovanni, the proof of whatever system he lived under was simpler. In 1943, he had eaten turnips stolen from frozen fields, watching German tanks roll by on their way to crush his own army. In 1948, he stood under a metal roof, had a regular wage from Fiat, and knew that no one would knock on his door at midnight to conscript him for a hopeless campaign in Russia or to ask why he had not raised his arm in salute. The cost of that relative safety, he understood, included silence about what he had seen in occupied Yugoslavia, about the villages burned under Italian command, about friends who had done worse than tighten bolts for the Duce. He carried that silence like another tool in his box. On the wall of the Fiat plant, a new poster appeared one day. Fiat, building the future of Italy. Underneath, a car sped along a modern highway, the countryside green, the sky clear. No soldiers, no flags. Giovanni looked at it during his break and thought, we built the old future too, the one with tanks and speeches. This time, perhaps, the bolts will hold longer. In the decades to come, historians would write thick volumes on Italy's passage from fascism to republic, on the elections of 1948, on CIA influence, on the PCI's mischances, on the years of lead yet to come. They would analyze parties and policies, church encyclicals and secret reports. Few would mention men like Giovanni by name. Yet it was their willingness to trade tank driving for bolt tightening, to accept a smaller, more ordinary Italy over a glorious, doomed one, that made the fragile democracy and economic growth of the late 1940s and 1950s possible. Former soldier of Mussolini's army, now working on a Fiat assembly line, he summarized his life in a single sentence, written once in his notebook, and never shown to anyone. Yesterday I drove tanks for the Duce. Today I tighten bolts for the Republic. I have learned that peace is made not by victories in war, but by people who agree to live with less glory and more compromise.